IO Reinsurance. He's also chairman of the National Space Society of Australia. He's the director of the National Space Society. He's chairman of numerous National Space Society committees. This person is, needs no further introduction. Tell us how we're going to get into space from Australia.
Thanks, Larry. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This will be a relatively brief presentation, I guess, for a couple of reasons. Those of you who sort of saw me speaking yesterday, I was speaking in my space was underwriter, which is where I do my living. And as Larry's mentioned, I am director of the National Space Society and I chair the National Space Society of Australia. However, the presentation that I'm giving this morning, I'm actually giving in my capacity as chairman of the Australian Space Industry Chapter of Commerce, which is effectively the Australian Space Industry Association. And I'm actually giving this presentation on behalf of a company called International Resource Corporation. The presentation was entitled Establishing Australian Spaceport, and in fact, I'm not going to be able to give you some of the detail that I had hoped we would be able to. The plan was that today would be the grand global presentation, effectively, or at least the first presentation of the conference of the Spaceport project. Unfortunately, the public announcement got pushed back from the beginning of May to July, so I unfortunately can't give you some of the details which I am actually privy to download, which I will talk about. So take this as a bit of a pre-scoop of what I hope you will get to see being announced in about July. Anyway, most of you would be aware of a proposal that goes back now nearly 10 years, in fact probably more than 10 years, to establish a commercial spaceport in Australia, and the original proposed site was Kirby Ikin. That proposal has gone through many iterations with different consortia. There are currently a couple of different consortia hoping to do things in Australia. However, I do know from my own involvement with this project that this particular consortium does have the wherewithal to make the project work. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm making this presentation on behalf of a company called IRC, National Resource Corporation. IRC is an Australian company formed specifically for the purposes of the project of developing a spaceport. And the name for that spaceport is the Asia Pacific Space Centre. The company, at least as far as I have been involved with it, has at least 18 months of current involvement with the project. And in fact, the partners involved with it from Australia have been involved for many years, I shouldn't say many years, several years, project to fruition. And a number of things have occurred which now make it a viable project and bring us to a very exciting point in the project's development. International Resource Corporation has actually acquired the land for the spaceport, an expenditure which is not inconsequential in its own right. The site is at a place called Temple Bay on the Cape York Peninsula. For those of you who have any kind of sense of the shape of Australia, Cape York, and the Cape York Peninsula is the pointy bit on the right towards the top. In the state of Queensland.
Towards our top or your top?
That's a good point. Our top, not yours. In the deep south. The site is approximately 1,700 square kilometres, or around about 600 odd square miles. So again, it's a fairly sizable site that they have acquired. And this, as I say, I can't tell you a lot of the things about the project, but there are little things that give it away, such as Russian experts making comments about the site. While Cape York maybe doesn't have all of the best attributes, in total package, it's probably one of the best places to build a launch site. And while French Guiana, the Kourou site, for example, is closer to the equator, at about, I think it's 5 degrees, and Cape York is about 12 to 13. The overall package in Australia, we believe, is what makes it attractive for a commercial launch site. This is just a quick chart to give you a sense of where the spaceport is on that big pointy bit to the right, on the right-hand side of Australia. The launch site, Temple Bay, is right up near the top. Just a couple of quick aspects to point out. First of all, the Cape York Peninsula is a relatively barren area, and
Most of Australia, as you would appreciate, is relatively unpopulated, and in fact that is one of the attractive aspects of Cape York. To the very near the top at the left, you can see a site called Weaver. That is actually a very large mining town with a deep water port. So within reasonable proximity, and we're talking fairly large distances still here of a couple of 100 kilometres, you have a deep water port. You also have, I guess the largest main city that any of you may know of is Cairns, down near the bottom on the right. But there is of Cairns, not really sure, a couple of 100,000 I think. It's really more of a tourist resort rather than anything else. But also, right up near the top, near the proposed Cape York site, is an RAAF, Royal Australian Air Force Air Base, RAAF Sherga, which has just been built as a bare bones air base there for times of emergency. So it has the runways and all the facilities of a major air base, but it's not staffed by other than a skeleton crew. And that will be within reasonable proximity, again, proximity being a few tens of kilometres. So in terms of infrastructure, you're a long, long way from population centres by and large. However, you do have the mining town, the deep water port, the RAAF base within relatively close proximity.
Is there any land road access?
You can actually see a road
That's close.
heading up. Yeah, gets relatively close. There are advantages in not having too much access to a site. In fact, I remember reading some years ago that the French, well, the Ahern launch site at French Guiana, there is actually one main road, the main highway that runs down the country, and the Europeans that run the launch site actually had to move the highway further away from the launch site, interestingly so that the launch vehicles would be out of range of manned portable surface-to-air missiles, which is something that we hope we wouldn't have a problem with in Australia. Anyway, I'll keep moving on to keep going time-wise. Now clearly why do this in Australia? Well, Australia has certain advantages in its own right, and the Cape York site has certain advantages of its own. First and foremost really is proximity to the equator. If you're going to build a facility like this, then it's illogical to do it anywhere other than close to the equator. The Kennedy Space Centre, as you would know, is about, I think it's 28 degrees roughly north. Baikonur is, I think, is on the order of 56 degrees. Irkutsk is certainly a long way north. Kourou, as I say, is at 5 degrees, and Cape York will be relatively attractive at around 12 or 13 degrees. Proximity to the equator allows you to lift heavier payloads, and I believe, although I've seen some conflicting data here, but I believe the payload advantage with existing vehicles will be on the order of about 20% improved payload capacity. That, of course, in an economic sense, translates into either bigger, heavier satellites that you can generate more revenue off, or longer life for those satellites. Cape York also has relatively stable weather conditions and essentially allows you to launch virtually all year long. There are the occasional cyclones, but it's not something of a dramatic concern. It wouldn't impact year-round operations. There's also very good access to the trajectories that are of primary interest, namely equatorial orbits. There's basically nothing much to the east of Australia for quite a long way, at least launching from the Cape York site. So you've got good clear access, you can drop in your stages out over the ocean. As I've mentioned before, it's relatively a long way from populated centres. Weaver is a long way in the opposite direction to launch, and there aren't any other sort of townships in the immediate vicinity. I think one of the major characteristics that contrasts Australia to French Guiana is the political and economic stability. Australia has a fairly unique kind of position in the world in terms of being friendly with virtually everybody. Also, something that's perhaps just a little bit less relevant today, but still, I think, strongly relevant, is our membership of the Missile Technology Control Regime. This was clearly more relevant back in the early or late 80s, rather, when the project was first being looked at. there was a great deal of sensitivity, certainly in a Cold War or colder war type environment than we were in now. However, now there's probably greater interest in missile technology proliferation, and that, while I certainly don't mean to cast aspersions on any other country, it probably means that a country like Australia has, it reduces the risk and the concerns that various countries would have in bringing this kind of technology to Australia. And then one that I think is very interesting, and I will try to highlight later on, which is very important, is our closer geographic proximity to Asia. Australia Australia projects itself as a gateway to Asia. We're culturally very similar to Western nations, particularly to the US, to England and other parts of Europe. But we are really, geographically, part of the Asia-Pacific region. And Australia, for better or for worse, is treated, sometimes grudgingly, as part of the region by other countries. And as many of you may know, many of the countries in Asia are not so much parochial, but they're very strongly supportive of building up industry and capabilities within the region. So there is a sense that countries that are launching satellites for the region would probably find it desirable to have a local regional spaceport to launch from. And interestingly, where I'll return to this at the end, is the fact that the Asia-Pacific market now actually represents the single largest market for satellites in the world. Around about 1/3 of all satellites being launched are going up for Asia-Pacific countries. So, getting on to how the project is moving ahead. One of the key things is the fact that IRC has been granted major project facilitation status by both the federal government and more recently by the state government of Queensland. Now what that status does is it means that the project gets fast-tracked through all the various government departments that have to deal with that. And as you can imagine, something as significant as the Spaceport is going to touch on sort of everything from economic relations, foreign relations, environmental issues, legal issues. You name it, just about every government department's going to have a finger in the pie. The other interesting thing about this is that it does mean that both the federal and state governments have investigated the financial and technical aspects of the project and do believe that IRC is capable of bringing the necessary technical and financial resources to bear. Governments tend not to just put their backing behind these kinds of things lightly. So for external observers, this tends to give you some greater sense of credibility and comfort that the project will go ahead. It's also very important, if you go back to the chart that I or the diagram of the Cape York site and bearing in mind the remoteness and issues like that, one of the other key things that the major project facilitation status at the state level will confer in particular is that the government is committed to putting in place some of the infrastructure to support the project. So where those roads stop 30 or 40 or 50 kilometres short of Cape York, then the government will provide access roads to the RWAF base and so on. In fact, some of these, the dates and things that I'm going to quote to you shortly, even took me by surprise at some point. Preliminary design of the facility is already completed and was completed in February of this year. A large team of Russian engineers visited Australia, I think it was early to mid last year. They have been paid under a multi-million-dollar contract for this, so there is real money being spent. It's not just all kind of paper and talk at this point. I think we can move on. Again, that slide somewhat gave away the fact that it is a former Soviet Union launch vehicle that we're talking about here. Now, this is actually a layout of the launch facility itself. Item number 1, the orange area up to the top right, is actually the launch facility itself. The second big area with the 2 in the middle that you can hardly read is actually the processing facility. And some of the other features that you're seeing there are viewing towers, the Sydney theodolite station, and other things like that. One of the things that I actually find most intriguing about all of this, it's not a particularly exciting chart, but it's the Russian graphics lettering down the bottom, which I believe actually says commercial in confidence, so you're getting to see some of the interesting parts of their proposal. Next chart. This is a slightly more detailed design of the facility. 2 launch pads at the top. The item is numbered 1. I probably need to go into any of the other specifics with that. If anybody wants to look at the chart later on, they can, but it is relatively detailed in identifying the different components for the launch facility. So, getting down to who's involved, unfortunately we can't tell you who precisely, but we can tell you where they're coming from. It is a mixture of telecommunications and aerospace companies from all of the countries identified, and this is one of the key aspects, I think, to the project, the fact that we do have Indonesian, Australian, French, Korean and US companies involved, and of course Russian. If I recall correctly, the breakup, well, I might be leading in the wrong direction here, but the Australian component is majority Australian owned. It's on the order of about 55-65% Australian owned. And I believe Indonesia has something like 10%. I won't go into the other components. One of the reasons why we can't really actually talk too much about it here is that when it is announced, some of the players who will be in this will probably create some ripples throughout the space community, some possible realignments and so on. So watch this space and you'll hopefully see who those are. It's very frustrating that I had planned this was going to be the grand presentation, and unfortunately we had to pull back from that. As I say, in terms of where the project's up to, they do have the financial advisory agreements put in place. They have raised approximately $200 million with equity so far, and the rest of the debt, or the rest that will be debt, raised through 2 or 3 different banks in different parts of the world.
What's the total debt?
I believe total debt is estimated at about $300 or $400 million, but don't hold me to that. The environmental impact study has already started. It started a couple of months ago, and there are obviously a lot of different issues that need to be considered here. There are environmental, there are Aboriginal land rights issues, where we are looking at different types of launch vehicles, which the study is doing. They obviously have different types of fuels and different issues that need to be looked at, different drop zones and so on. Quick idea of the timeline. The public announcement is now due in July, and if I'm correctly informed by IRC, then the Prime Minister of Australia will be involved in making that announcement. As you can imagine, a $500 million project would attract the level of interest of the Prime Minister. Marketing also commences at the same time frame. One of the key aspects of this project is that it is, I think, fairly heavily tied to companies that have commercial interests in launching satellites and countries and industries who are interested in developing their space technology and space industry. So there is the ability to start immediately in marketing the launch service. Construction starts in October, not that far away. There's a very aggressive schedule, but they're quite confident that the environmental impact study will not turn up anything too undue. And of course, you've got to bear in mind that there have been various levels of study going on for nearly 10 years. And finally, first launch is scheduled for early 2000. So it's really not that far away. Perhaps it'll be one of the opening ceremonies for the Olympics in Sydney, I don't know. But anyway, that's the rough time frame that we're looking at. Now, just a couple of quick slides of my own that I've added at the end here. Many of you may not really realise, I guess it's of keen interest to me as an underwriter, knowing how many launches are going on. That's my business. But as you can see, just in really 3 or 4 years, a number of, I think this is largish GEO, satellites going into GEO, the number of those launches has doubled in only 3 or 4 years. And when you take into account the number of global sort of constellations of satellites that are being proposed to be launched, the numbers of launches required will be increasing even further. And what we're clearly seeing at the moment is that there is a clear undersupply of launch vehicles. And in fact, one of the interesting things about starting afresh with the launch site is that you can build a launch facility that's actually designed to launch quite frequently, whereas Ariane's bus is really locked into about a maximum of 12 launches a year. Atlas, I think, is locked into about 8 or 10 launches a year. So there are real limits on how many you can launch. You can't just keep churning them out based on existing launch facilities. And just one final chart to quickly illustrate some of the satellites going up for the region. This, by and large, are satellites that are being launched either this year or next year, all for the region. You can see just how many there are being proposed. These are all large geosynchronous orbit satellites. Some of them are regional systems, ACES under Indonesia, ABMT under Singapore, Asia Star in the middle. But all of these are going up just in the next 12 to 24 months. So I think that gives you a snapshot of the significant market that exists in the Asia Pacific region and just why there are natural geographic advantages in coming to that world. Anyway, I can see Larry getting up to push me off, so I think in the interests of time, maybe we can hold the questions till after, if I'm glad to answer any of them then. Otherwise,